Morning, Cedar Creek. Thank you. Your caffeine is kicked in. The rain has not discouraged you. Thank you for a little bit of energy there. I am so excited to be here, even more excited that you're joining us today as we're kicking off a brand new series of messages called Purpose. I assume all of us at one point or another have wrestled with this question of purpose. Like, why am I here? What is my life all about? Maybe you were in high school or college and you were trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do with my life? Or maybe for you it was sort of a midlife crisis kind of thing because you had achieved all this stuff that you thought would make you happy, the house, the white picket fence, the family, the kids, the great career, but you got to a point where you sort of started asking, really, is this all there is? Or maybe for you, it's when you transition into retirement. And for so long, your sense of purpose has been tied to your work or to raising your kids. And now the kids are grown and gone and the career's over and you're wondering, now what? What is this second half of my life supposed to be about? I think we all wrestle with that question. But I think what not a lot of us understand is that really how you answer that question has a huge impact on our daily lives. See, this question of purpose is not just some existential exercise for theologians and philosophers to wrestle with. It matters every day of our lives. I did a little Google search on purpose this week, and I was shocked to see just how much research and study has gone into this topic of purpose over the last 5 or 6 years. There were tons of studies online. Some of them were done by, in the medical field. Some were done by sociologists. Some were done by psychiatrists. And some were even done by the business world. And all of these different studies and all these different aspects of our life, they all came to this one single conclusion. That people who live with a strong sense of purpose live longer, healthier, and more emotionally resilient lives. And if you stop and think about it, that makes sense, right? Because if you recognize something bigger, a bigger purpose, it keeps you motivated, right? It keeps you getting up and going and moving forward. When you have a sense of a bigger purpose, it helps you get through those difficult circumstances. You can see beyond just the darkness of that day. But what those studies don't show us is that if my purpose is based on me, if my purpose is seen through the lens of what I want or what I feel, or if my purpose is based on what other people think I ought to do with my life, it may keep you moving forward in a positive direction for a season, but ultimately that kind of purpose is going to leave you empty and unfulfilled. Why? Because our purpose is greater than ourselves. We were created for so much more than just trying to look good and feel good and have more goods in our life. This whole issue of purpose begins and ends with God, not me. Bertrand Russell, the famous 20th century philosopher and atheist, once famously said, "Unless you assume a God, the question of purpose is meaningless." And he was right. If this is all random chance, cosmic accident over time, then purpose, there's no such thing as purpose. Purpose comes when there is someone bigger, a God above. See, that's the thing you need to understand about purpose. You can't find it in yourself. You can't even find it in the people around you. And let me put it this way. If you want to know the purpose of a thing, don't ask the thing. Ask the one who created the thing, right? Somebody's going to get that in a minute. If you want to know the purpose of a thing, don't ask the thing, ask the one who created the thing. And yet, how often do we run around trying to find purpose in some sense of self-fulfillment in the moment? Or we run around to other people and go, all right, well, you're a thing, I'm a thing. What do you think my thing is? What do you think I ought to do with my life? I love what Paul writes in Colossians 1:16. Paul says, for in Him, in Jesus, all things were created. All things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, all things, including us, have been created through Him and for Him. We are created by God, for God. Now, I'm pretty sure most of us in here today are watching online. We have no problem believing that we were created by God. You probably wouldn't be at church if you didn't think you were created by God. Here's where we struggle, figuring out what it means to live for God. If I'm created for God's purposes, then what are His purposes for my life? I think one of the reasons that we struggle to understand God's purpose for our life is that when we think about our purpose, we tend to think of it in this kind of one big thing, right? This big capital P, that my whole life is all about this one moment or this one accomplishment. You know, I think maybe my purpose is to be a missionary or to be a doctor or to cure cancer. Like it's this one big moment, this capital P purpose. But what we see clearly in God's Word is that it's not about one big ultimate purpose for our life. It is about fulfilling God's little p purposes in the moments and days and relationships in our life. Instead of sitting around wondering about what am I supposed to do with my life, maybe it would be better to say, God, what is my purpose in this moment, in this conversation, in this encounter? Because maybe my purpose is just to be there and listen to somebody who desperately needs someone to share with. Or maybe my purpose in this moment is just to be an encourager. It's those little p purposes. And here's the thing. When we are faithful day in and day out in the little p purposes, over time we will look back and see we have ultimately fulfilled God's capital P purpose in our lives. I kind of think that's what Jesus was talking about when He said, if you have been faithful in the little things, I will put you in charge of bigger things. And so what I want to do over these next several weeks in this series is look at some of these little p purposes, these 5 universal little p purposes that God has created all of us to live. And then I want us to talk specifically about how to live these out in community as a church family. How do we live out these little p purposes, not in just my little individual world, but how do we live this out collectively as a church family? So does that kind of make sense? You kind of see where we're going with this? Good. All right, so today I kind of want to kick this thing off, kind of take up maybe a 30,000-foot view. I want to spend a few minutes looking at some of the barriers, some of the things that keep us from living these little p purposes faithfully, day in and day out. And then secondly, I want to look at how purpose brings power to my life. When I live for God's purposes, it actually has practical power in the daily decisions, choices, and things that I go through and walk into. So let's start with barriers. What keeps us from living out God's purposes for our life? Well, the obvious answer is me. That's the number one answer. I keep me from living out God's purposes. We are all self-centered. We want what we want. We want the world to revolve around us. We want it to be about us. We just spent the last, 6 weeks talking about being selfish, this whole selfless series. I mean, we've been beating that horse to death for a month and a half. Enough said. That's a barrier, my self-centeredness, seeing everything through the lens of me. But there is a second barrier that I don't think we think about very often. Do you know another big barrier to you living out God's purposes? Other people. the people around you. And I don't mean that the way you think I mean that. I'm not saying that other people get in the way and keep you from living out God's purposes. I'm saying our desire for the approval of others keeps us from living out God's purposes for our lives. Running around, bouncing around like a pinball in a pinball machine, trying to keep everybody happy, everybody like us, keeps us from living out the purposes of our Creator. Help me out with this. I want you to use your imagination, okay? You got to work with me. Use your imagination. Imagine for just a moment, everybody likes you. Everybody. Everybody agrees with you all the time. Everybody thinks every decision you make is the right decision. Can you imagine that? Good, because that's as close as you're ever going to get. Right? It's not going to happen. Right? How many of you know you can't please everybody? Right? All of us, right? But here's the thing, let's get real. How much time and energy do we spend actually trying to do that? Right? Do you like me? Are we friends? Are we close? Do you follow me on Facebook? You know, I put that post. I worked hard on that picture, that Instagram picture. You didn't comment on it. Do you like this shirt? Right? Do you like this message series that I'm preaching? Do you like the way I'm preaching? Right? We run around chasing the approval of others, and we're never going to get it. You can't please everybody, but here's the good news. You can please God. And you know how you do that? By living out His purposes for your life. I love the way the Apostle Paul, he just cuts through the noise and says it straight out. Galatians 1:10. Paul's like, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be a servant of Christ. Let that sink in for a minute. If I'm living for the approval of others, it keeps me from God's purposes in my life. But here's the flip side of it. If I can just a little bit, if I can just a little bit let go of that desire for the approval of others, for everybody to like me, for everybody to think I'm doing the right thing, as I start to let go of that, it begins to open up my hands to be able to grasp on, day by day, moment by moment, encounter by encounter, with God's purpose for my life. Great example of this is a guy by the name of Moses. Most of you have heard of him. Moses is an Old Testament hero, but he's also written about in the New Testament book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 11, Moses is given as one of many examples of someone who lived a life of great faith. Now, a little bit of background. Moses was born the child of Hebrew slaves. He was born into the poverty and slavery of the Hebrew nation in Egypt. But through a crazy set of circumstances, he ends up actually being raised in the palace of Pharaoh. He actually becomes Pharaoh's grandson, a real prince of Egypt. But at some point, Moses comes to one of these purpose moments. Why am I here? And he makes a choice. Notice, beginning with verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Why? Because he was looking ahead to his reward. What did he do? What did Moses do? He chose purpose over popularity. He chose calling over comfort. He chose to look at his life and the circumstances of his life through a lens that was bigger than himself. Now understand, when Moses made this decision, he had no idea that God was going to use him to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land. He wouldn't know about that for another 40 years. It's not like Moses said, well, I'm going to be this great hero of the faith, the great deliverer of the nation of Israel. So yeah, I got to leave the palace. No, he just knew that was the next right thing. He knew that was his little p purpose in that moment. And because he was faithful in this little p, it opened the door to him to be able to fulfill that big P purpose in his life. That's the power of purpose. Now, I'm not Moses, you're not Moses, but that same power is available in our daily lives. 4 things, I want you to write these down. 4 things purpose will give us the power to do. You ready? Number 1, purpose gives us the power to minimize distractions. To minimize distractions. See, the problem for most of us isn't that we don't want to live God's purposes. The problem is we're so easily distracted by the voices and opinions of the people and the culture around us. You understand, our enemy, Satan, he has a very specific tactic in coming against us as believers. If you're a believer, you're a committed believer in Jesus Christ, Satan's not going to try to convince you to stop believing in Jesus. He knows that ship is already sailed. But what he loves to do is get us all busy and spun up in things that don't really matter. And I think if we're honest, we have to admit social media plays a huge role in this. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, I hope you do understand that social media platforms are built on an algorithm that is designed to keep you on the screen as long as possible. That's why you keep getting all this information about these topics that are so emotional to you. They're hooking you by your emotions, and all of a sudden you've spent half a day going down a rabbit hole on something that emotionally seemed important, but was truly a waste of your time. And then on top of that, social media amplifies the opinions of everybody around you. You want to know if people like or don't like what you're doing or thinking? Post it on social media. They'll let you know right in the comments whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not saying that social media is evil and bad and we ought to get rid of it. It can be used for a lot of wonderful things. We as a church, many of you use social media as a great place, as a megaphone for hope and Jesus. I'm just saying, when you get on it, be aware you're in the devil's playground. And he would love to keep you so distracted by things that feel so important, right? I love what Paul, the Apostle Paul, does. He's writing a letter to his young protege in the ministry, a young pastor by the name of Timothy. And he wants to make this point to Timothy about not getting distracted by things that don't matter. And he uses the analogy of a Roman soldier. Look at what he says, 2 Timothy 2:4. Soldiers don't get tied up in the affairs of civilian life. Why? For then they cannot please the officer who enlisted them. Right? If you're so busy trying to please everybody here, you can't please the one you are supposed to please. Here's the bottom line. The more tied up I become in politics, culture wars, and the latest thing Taylor Swift did or said, the less focused I'm going to be on God's purposes for my life. One of my favorite examples of this ever is a guy in the Old Testament by the name of Nehemiah. Now, even though Nehemiah has a book in the Old Testament that carries his name, he was neither a prophet nor a priest. He was simply a servant of the king of Persia. He was part of that exile, that diaspora of the nation of Israel that had been carried away into captivity by the Persians. And he was just serving as a cupbearer, a fairly lowly servant position. And while he's in that position, he starts getting these reports. He's overhearing these things in the palace about how the city of Jerusalem has fallen into disrepair. This city of Jerusalem that means so much to every member of the nation of Israel. And these reports, they are breaking his heart. He gets a burden for the city of Jerusalem. Little side note. A lot of times when you have a burden, something breaks your heart, that's God calling you into that as a purpose for your life. That's why you have that burden. Anytime you think somebody ought to do thus and such, it's probably God saying your little p purpose is to do such and such. So Nehemiah, he does something about it. He gets permission from the king, and he takes a few guys back, and he goes back to the city of Jerusalem, and he's just going back to start just by rebuilding the wall. Parts of the wall have been torn down, and he's like, I'm just going to rebuild the wall. Now listen, he's not going because he knows God's going to make him this great leader, that he's going to be a great governor. He just knows somebody ought to rebuild that wall. So he just shows up, puts up a ladder, and starts stacking up stones. He's just doing manual labor. This is no super spiritual, holy God moment. He's just laying some brick. And while he's carrying out that little p purpose that God has created him for, two enemies of God show up and they start shouting up to Nehemiah on the ladder, dude, that's stupid. You're wasting your time. It'll never work. You don't know what you're doing. They start posting stuff on Facebook about how stupid Nehemiah is for trying to build this. And here is Nehemiah doing what God has called him to do. And these loud voices of doubt and discouragement are screaming up at him. And I love his response. Nehemiah 6:3. I am doing a great work and I can't come down. I'm doing a great work and I can't come down. Nehemiah, what are you talking about? Doing a great work? You're just putting bricks on the wall. What do you mean you're doing a great work? It's great because it's what God has called me to do in this moment. Say it out loud with me, all of our campuses. I'm doing a great work and I can't come down. Let me hear you. I'm doing a great work and I can't come down. One more time. I'm doing a great work and I can't come down. I ain't got time for what you think. I ain't got time for your negativity. I ain't got time for your discouragement. And I cannot tell you how many times over the last 30 years as a pastor where I've had to sit in my office and say through tears, I'm doing a great work and I ain't coming down. I'm sorry you don't like this or you don't like that. I'm sorry you sent that email or posted that thing on social media that about whatever you don't like about Cedar Creek or my decisions or leadership's choices. I'm sorry, but I'm doing a great work and I ain't coming down. And that's not just because I'm a preacher. Every day when you're carrying out God's purpose for that moment, you are doing a great work. And when you focus on that, it'll cut through the clutter. It'll minimize the distractions, and it will defeat the discouragement that keeps so many of us from living the life we were created to live. Number 2, write this one down. Purpose gives me the power to push through the pain. To push through the pain. Purpose gives me the strength to keep going when the going hurts. I want to be up front with you. Living out God's purposes for your life, it ain't going to be no little happy skip through lollipop land. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be painful. Let me say it this way. The pathway to purpose is paved with pain. Let me say that again. The pathway of purpose is paved with pain. So look, if you're new to this whole church thing, you're just kind of not sure about this Jesus and, you're just kind of checking it out. I don't want you to ever feel a bait and switch from Cedar Creek Church. So I just want to tell you straight up, following Jesus is not an invitation to an easy life. It is an invitation to an uphill grind. That's why Paul tells us to fight the good fight. Never forget, it is a fight. It was for Moses. right? Again, look at verses 25 and 26. He, Moses, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Why? Because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses was able to push through the pain. And by the way, the pain was not just being mistreated when he gave up his palace for poverty. The pain wasn't just when he had to go face to face with Pharaoh, the most powerful human being on the planet at that time. Even when he was doing what God called him to do, leading the nation of Israel across the desert and into the promised land. It was a painful journey. Read the book of Exodus. He leads a million whining, complaining, never satisfied group of people. 40 years of a painful journey. And when they get to the edge of the promised land, he don't even get to go in. God calls him home to heaven. How could he keep going? Because he was looking beyond his temporary circumstances and pushing through the pain for a greater glory, something bigger. Now, here's the thing anyway. Life is painful, period. Whether you're living for yourself, living for the approval of others, or living out God's purposes, it's all painful. Nobody gets out of this life unscathed. So the question is, do I want that pain to be wasted? Or do I want it to be used for God's greater purpose? The greatest tragedy in life isn't the pain we go through. The greatest tragedy in life is going through it without seeing a greater purpose. And when you are a Christ follower living out His purposes, God promises to use it for something bigger. Romans 8:28, you know this promise, right? And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Not everything's good, but when we live out God's purposes, He is able to bring good out of it. Now, please hear my heart here. Please hear my heart. I'm not standing up here trying to minimize the pain you're walking through. I'm not up here saying, suck it up, buttercup, put on your big girl panties, because God's going to use it. What I'm saying is in that pain, when you look for God's higher purpose, it will raise your eyes just a little bit out of that darkness, that pain, that loss, and allow you to catch just a small glimpse of hope for a moment. And that little glance of hope can help you take the next breath, can give you the strength to take the next step, and just keep moving forward. That's the power of purpose. And then finally, the third thing purpose gives me the power to do is to connect deeply with others. To deeply connect with others. Why? Because living out God's purposes is not a solo sport. We are called to live out these purposes in authentic community with each other as believers. See that with Moses. Look at verse 25. Again, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God. You catch that? Moses wasn't called just to lead the people of God. He was called to walk with and be a part of God's family. The reality is, in our 21st century, all about me culture and world that caters and even sends me news that I prefer and tells me what I want to buy before I even know I want to buy. In that self-centered world, where our own self-centered is so deeply ingrained in us, we even tend to see God's purposes for me as somehow being just about me. You can't live out God's purposes for your life apart from being in authentic community with a handful of other believers. I'm going to say that again. You cannot live out God's purposes for your life apart from being in authentic community with a small group of other believers. That's why notice what Paul writes to this little group of believers in the city of Corinth. He says, live in harmony with each other. Let there be no divisions in the church. Rather be of one mind, united in thought and purpose. We are united around a bigger purpose. And so God's purpose will allow me to connect with others beyond just the surface similarities and the people I like and the people who are like me. I can't tell you in the last 25 years how many times I've seen this happen. Because I'll see people go together as a home group and I know them and I'm like, those people don't belong in the same room together. They are so different, their personalities, their politics. Somebody's going to get hurt if these people get in a home group together. And yet what I see over time is as they focus on fulfilling God's purpose as a group, it really connects them on the stuff that doesn't matter, and it minimizes the differences that we make such a big deal about. That's the power of purpose. I've seen it with some of our short-term global outreach teams. I've seen people get on a plane, 5 or 6 people on a team who really don't even know each other, and they go serve for 10 days drilling a well or feeding children in Guatemala and fulfilling those purposes. They come back, they're lifelong friends, and they were strangers before. And listen, how important is this right now in our world and in our lives? Where we've never been more divided and we've never felt more isolated. Loneliness and isolation is at an all-time high, and divisions are at an all-time high. We don't need to agree on everything to be in community. We just need to agree that the main thing is each of us living out God's purposes in our lives. So I'm going to encourage you over these next 6 weeks, if you're not connected with a home group at Cedar Creek, if Cedar Creek is your church, if this is your home, this is where you want to belong, you think this is your family, get in a home group just for the next 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, you don't like it, you can leave. But do it. Whatever campus you're on, you can get on the app, you stop by a welcome center, grab somebody. Somebody can help you get connected in a home group. Because here's why. You can come every week, listen to me talk about and teach about these purposes and how they work in your life, but it ain't going to change a thing until you live them out in community, because that's what they were meant to be used for. So let me close with this last verse, this familiar verse from Philippians chapter 3, because I'm convinced this is really our goal over this next 6 weeks of purpose. Paul says, I focus on this one thing. Forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead, I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Jesus Christ, is calling us. Not me, not you, us. Would you pray with me? I don't know where you're at. I don't know what your struggles are, what you're dealing with, but I know that I know this. You are not an accident, and you are not listening to this message today by chance. God is pursuing you in love, and He wants to give you the gift of His purpose to free you from the exhaustion of trying to please everybody else. He wants to break those chains of approval that have held some of us in bondage for decades. But it ain't going to happen by just sitting and soaking and listening and learning. You got to start looking for how you live out that little p purpose of today with a few other brothers and sisters in Christ who want to do that with you. Father, this is your church. Jesus, you have promised you will build it. So you got to move. Your Spirit's got to move right now if anything's going to happen for your glory. So have your way right now, Lord, with your church. and with my life. It's in your name I pray. Amen.